Welcome to Integro Talks, a podcast series brought to you by Integro Advisers, where we dive into the world of compliance, risk management, and due diligence, and provide you with expert insight and analysis to help you make more informed business decisions. Hello, and welcome back to our podcast. I'm your host, Alberto de la Portilla. Thank you for tuning into Integro Talks. We continue our podcast series on forecasting the impact of a second Trump administration on different sectors of the economy. So far, we have covered the Trump 2.0 effect on corporate mergers and acquisitions between the U.S. and Latin America, banking and regulatory compliance, and immigration and the flow of remittances. In this episode, we will cover economic sanctions. For years, U.S. presidents have used the powers of the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, to carry out its foreign policy goals. OFAC administers and enforces economic and trade sanctions against targeted foreign countries and regimes, terrorists, international criminals, proliferators of weapons of mass destruction, and other threats to the national security and the economy of the United States. Since Trump returned to the White House 4 months ago, his America First approach to foreign policy has brought with it renewed economic pressure, an emphasis on counterterrorism and transnational criminal organizations honing in on drug cartels in Mexico, and the inflow of fentanyl into the United States. And the administration is doing so unilaterally, without much interest in multilateral diplomacy. How will Trump's second term affect the use of economic and commercial sanctions as a foreign policy tool going forward? How will it differ from Trump's previous term in office? I've invited Saskia Rietbroek to the podcast today. Saskia is the executive director and co-founder for the Association of Certified Sanction Specialists, serving in that role since 2018. The ACSS is a global professional membership body for sanctioned professionals. She has over 15 years of experience in sanctions and anti-money laundering in the U.S., Latin America, and Europe. Saskia, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Alberto. It's my pleasure to be here.
Good morning. So much to cover with this topic, but I want to start with kind of what you see today with the administration, how they're sort of using OFAC today. And I'll just kind of give you some data points to start with, just based on some of the research I've done. The most recent updates to the OFAC SDN list were involving two narco traffickers from Mexico, from the Noreste cartel, I believe. And then there were some actions taken against Iran and Hezbollah. Another data point that I thought would be interesting, and this may play into your response, is looking at Trump 1.0 from 2017 to about this same time back in 2017, there were 24 updates to the sanction list, and there were 3 enforcement actions during the first 4 months of his first presidency. This time, there are 36 sanction list updates, 0 enforcement actions. So I just wanted to start with what you envision this administration, how it's going to proceed. We can get into some of the more details later in terms of specific countries, specific types of sanctions. But just in general terms, how do you see this administration versus the last administration vis-a-vis sanctions?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think from a high level perspective, over time, sanctions will keep on increasing. And that is not so much because we have a new administration in the U.S., but if I look at it from a longer, bigger, like a zooming out perspective, what we've seen in the last couple of decades, that sanctions have continuously increased. So why is that? Not because of a particular leader, who is at the helm of the U.S. government, or who is at the who is the leader of the EU the EU Council, but it's more like it's about structural economic reasons and economic security. So
Good.
I think this is why we have seen an increase in sanctions and will continue to see an increase in sanctions, because nations on both sides of the Atlantic see sanctions as a way to protect their own economy. And in this intense geopolitical climate, I think we will continue to see this,
Right.
It is very early to say what Trump will be doing. I have, some thoughts on it, but I think in a bigger perspective, I think the sanctions will continue to increase, whether it's enforcement or whether it's, new sanctions or more people on the lists. I think that's just a bigger picture. We have such an intense geopolitical environment that countries, not only the US, but also other countries, are using sanctions, not because they are so concerned about human rights or about terrorism, but to try to get economic security for their own country. So that's from a bigger perspective.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, I noticed a week ago, to that point, the U.S. So I mentioned in the introduction about this approach, this sort of unilateral approach that the U.S. has taken in the previous administration, Biden administration, not the previous Trump administration. There was a lot more diplomacy. There was a lot more interaction with allies. I mean, in the case of Russia and the invasion of Ukraine, it was clear the entire, all the sanctioning bodies all kind of were aligned. Now we're starting to see a little bit breakdown in that multilateral diplomacy. I know recently there was some news about the UK and the EU imposing increasing sanctions on Russia related to the Ukrainian war. Just there's also been some news about the UK targeting Israeli settlers in the Gaza. So that's related to the Israel-Palestine conflict. You don't see the U.S. to engage there. So do you see this as, talking about as sanctions are increasing and there is benefit to countries using sanctions in order to protect the economies, do you see multilateral diplomacy just kind of that's in the past? Do you see this is a new normal where countries are just going to do what they want to do? Do you foresee even friction between past partners of the U.S. And the U.S. itself? Just curious to know what your thoughts are on working together versus working on your own.
Yeah, I think it depends on the regime. So, for instance, if you look at the Russia regime, I think we will see divergence, right? The US will go one way, EU, UK will go the other way. And the EU, of course, we have an existential reason, right? Why we want to keep those sanctions on Russia quite strong.
Right.
And the EU Commission is now, or the EU Council is now actually working on yet another package of sanctions against Russia. With regards to Russia, what Trump will do, I've been thinking about this, what can we expect? And it may, I think immediately we won't see an immediate ease of sanctions on Russia because he's negotiating, right? He's negotiating. He wants this war to end, right? So what I think he will use the sanctions as leverage to negotiate what he wants, which is the end of the war. So in the event that Russia proves amendable for these negotiations, he will ease them, but that's not happening at the moment. So I think what we may see is that there will be additional sanctions from the US on Russia, just as a negotiating tool.
Right.
So
and you're already starting. There was some reporting on Secretary of State Rubio mentioning the possibility of additional sanctions on Russia, but there's also some mixed messaging coming out of the U.S. Trump says one thing, and then the Secretary of State says something else. But
there's in general a lot of mixed messaging.
There have,
out of the US,
and maybe that's a strategy. I don't know. It's hard to gauge it. I do want to ask you about on this question of multilateral, unilateral. There was, interestingly, a week ago, and I don't know if you saw this, but the U.S. signed a MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, with the Swiss State Secretariat of Economic Affairs, or for Economic Affairs. And I'll quote what it says in the MOU: to express their intention to share information related to the monitoring, enforcement, and promotion of compliance with sanction measures in force on both sides. That's curious to me. I mean, did you come across that? Are you aware of that? I'm just curious, what was the motive behind that MOU?
Yeah, I don't know. What I do know is that there's a lot of Russian money in Switzerland.
Right.
So if they can invest, if they can get the records from Swiss banks, for instance, if the U.S. can get those records, and I don't know, I haven't seen this memorandum, so I'm not sure what it covers, but that, maybe it's a way to get information about where some of these oligarchs that are, on the U.S. sanctions list, where they keep their money.
Yeah, I thought that was that's a great response. I do think that that's a very valid response. The issue on Russian oligarchs, there is also some news out there about the U.S. sort of reprioritizing away from Russian oligarchs. Yeah. Again, mixed messaging, right? If what you're saying as far as the Swiss is accurate, which makes a lot of sense to me, but then the other side of the coin is and they have made it public, that the focus is not going to be on Russian oligarchs. It's going to be more focused on kind of more border-related issues involving the cartel, the influx of fentanyl.
Yeah, that's what I hear as well. That I was speaking to some banks, U.S. banks, and there was a meeting some weeks ago in D.C. where banks had been summoned to come to Washington, D.C. and talk about their priorities, and it was all about Mexican drug cartel laundering. What the banks had to explain what they are doing in regards to that. With regards to their compliance efforts, the word Russia wasn't even mentioned in that meeting. So that, to me, that gives a big sign that this is not a priority. So
beyond Russia, there has been a lot of sanction activity related to Iran, and they're really trying to squeeze Iran in terms of making sure that they don't have access to nuclear or gain access to nuclear arms. There's been quite a few updates on the sanction list related to Iran, and that's going to continue. I don't see the U.S. backing down from that.
No, I don't think so. I think that will definitely be a priority, and they've said that, right? The maximum pressure on Iran. Right. So I think that, and that was also a topic of discussion in that DC meeting that I mentioned, and I wasn't there, but that's what I hear from our members, that Iran was definitely a topic of interest for Treasury. And they were asking the banks, what they are doing with regards to that priority, how they are tackling, what are they doing in terms of compliance efforts to focus on the Iran sanctions.
Right. Yeah. Iran, certainly, they're not backing off from Iran. Let me ask you about another quote unquote boogeyman in the U.S., according to the Trump administration, which is China. So do you, in your if you look at your crystal ball, do you expect economic sanctions by the U.S. applied to Chinese entities? Now, granted, there's been news about U.S. or China being involved in, obviously, the smuggling of fentanyl into the United States, which is a growing problem here in the U.S. with opioid addiction. Of course, cyber hacking. The Chinese and Russians, but Chinese, as we're talking about China, are have been behind a lot of that activity. Crypto fraud also. Do you see the U.S. using sanctions to continue to pressure China on as far as, get negotiating trade? Like, how do you see China playing into the sanction environment?
Yeah, I think you mentioned it, right? The fentanyl crisis, because those, China supplies
Right.
those chemicals, and they are then produced in Mexico, I understand. But because they come from China, that is definitely they are determined at the Trump administration to tackle that fentanyl crisis. So that will definitely they want that to end. So you'll probably see some organizations that are involved in that trade being sanctioned, whether it's Mexican or Chinese. What I also think is that China will receive more pressure when it comes to buying oil from Iran. Again, it's this other priority, the Iranian, the maximum pressure on Iran that will have an impact on China. So that's how I see it. So Iran is now exporting a lot more to China. And so I think that's where I don't know otherwise what we can expect in terms of Chinese sanctions. Yeah.
We've all witnessed how the Trump administration is leaning heavily into tariffs and on imports from various countries, reciprocal tariffs across the board. Some of these are being negotiated, we've been told. This sort of integration of tariffs and trade policy, and it's almost, tariffs are almost being used as negotiating tools, similar to what a sanction could be.
Yeah.
Do you see this more and more, this integration? Do you see this integration?
Yeah, I think in that sense, sanctions are a little bit like tariffs, right? They're both viewed as a tool for economic or diplomatic coercion.
Right.
So I think in that sense, sanctions are different, right? I mean, the tariffs, they basically impose a tax on imports, right? Sanctions restrict exports, can restrict imports.
Right.
And they typically have not like an immediate effect. So it's more like a long-term effect, and their efficacy is harder to assess. So tariffs have an immediate effect. And I think that's why Trump likes it, right? It's immediate.
That's right.
Sanctions, you can put them in place, but it takes longer for them to take effect. It also takes a lot longer to take them away. And it's not because he cannot sign an executive order that would take it away, but, the risk appetite from big companies, from banks, and from global exporters, once you have sanctions in place, they built this whole framework around it. When you take away the sanctions, it's not just the day after, all the payments will come through. So sanctions have, just because of that reason alone, they have a long-term effect.
Right.
So there's a connection, but they're different. Yeah,
they're different, but obviously there are similarities, and there are as a tool that at least Trump is using as to carry out his foreign policy objectives, which is right now focused on negotiating better trade deals with countries. But I think in the end, it's really about China, and China's and trying to negotiate stronger terms with China. Let's talk a little about Latin America. A lot of the listeners or subscribers to our podcast are in Latin America. They're financial institutions, they're chief risk officers, compliance officers, sanction officers. How do you see the Trump administration's OFAC actions being carried out in Latin America? We know of Venezuela, and we know of Cuba. We know already that in Venezuela they have at least reversed on the Chevron general license, making it difficult for the export of petrol. And in Cuba, I don't think there's been anything done on Cuba. But how do you see OFAC being, is there going to be any significant changes vis-a-vis Latin America? And then I have a follow-up.
Yeah, I would think that with the new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, his focus has always been, for a long time at least, pressure on Venezuela. So I think with him at the helm of Department of State, we will see a significant focus from Department of State on Nicaragua and increasing those sanctions on Venezuela, and that Treasury would follow that direction, so I think I expect more sanctions on Venezuela. For that matter, Cuba, there are already a lot of heavy sanctions on Cuba. Biden, lifted some of them or eased them. I see them becoming more stronger again. Yeah,
we have clients in Central America that in Panama that represent logistic companies. They have a free trade zone in Panama, and so they are receiving shipments, and sometimes those ships end up in Cuba, or they come from Cuba. And for a short period of time last year, there was a reversal on policy to allow some of these transactions to occur. U-turn transactions are referred to. Don't think that's been reversed, but I would expect the Trump administration will reverse that to continue to squeeze Cuba. Do you see China is so integrated in so many different economies in Latin America? Peru, Panama, they're very active in Brazil. Do you see a broader, again, this whole question of China being, again, the boogeyman, and how the U.S. and particularly Trump is trying to squeeze China as much as possible. Do you see any kind of sanctions related to Chinese activity in LATAM? Given their full-scale, integration in the economies.
I don't know about LATAM in particularly, but I wanted to tell you that I was at a conference in D.C. in March, just a few months ago, where Secretary Lutnick from Department of Commerce, he gave a speech. He gave a keynote speech. It was at the BIS, Bureau of Industry and Security update conference, and the Bureau of Industry and Security, they're the part of Commerce Department. They're sort of a sister agency of OFAC, right? But at Commerce, and they deal with export controls. And he was very, very strong on China. He was, his message that, he called BIS the keeper of the flame of the intellectual front line of national security of the United States. And he was talking about we are at a place where core technology of the U.S. Life is being challenged. He called the threats from China relentless, and that it will continue, and the role of export controls and BIS is to hold and protect the U.S. way of life.
Right.
He even mentioned the Panama Canal, if I remember that correctly. He said, he was talking about that, making that link to Latin America, that, U.S. built the Panama Canal, the U.S. lost life. It was very emotional, U.S. lost lives, lost money. Then the Panama Canal was, given back to the Panamanians. And he was saying, if you look at, if you look at the Panama Canal, 70% of every letter on every container of, or buildings at the Panama Canal is Chinese. It was sold out. So
Yeah.
He was very, very adamant about that, and in his view, it was fundamentally wrong. So just by listening to that speech, I was like, okay, well, there will be, definitely, they're gonna be tackling China.
Yeah, I agree with you. I do think, I mean, the Panama Canal issue, I was just there this week, and I talked to a lot of people about it. It's a very sensitive subject. I mean, if you're Panamanian, it taps into, issues of national sovereignty. And so, interestingly, I was staying at a hotel where in the first morning I was there, actually, in every morning that I went to have breakfast, there were some U.S. military personnel having breakfast there. And I asked others, that who I met with later, these are people in the banking community and Panamanians, and they said, yeah, we're starting to see more of a U.S. military presence here. There was a MOU signed between the U.S. and Panama recently, but is that going towards just sort of scaring away the Chinese? Chinese are also there. The Chinese have been traveling there. They send groups of government officials and business people to continue to maintain that they have access to the port. Most of the activity that runs through the port ends up in the U.S. So the U.S. is by far, according to data that I saw, they are by far the using the Panama Canal more than China. For China is second, but China is way down than the U.S. But I wonder. It's interesting because it's very complex. And China and Panama and then China and other places like Peru, they just built a seaport there to help.
Yeah, in Peru, I heard a big port. Yeah,
big port, because they need access to the port so that they also need to have storage facilities for their products so that they can distribute to Mexico, the U.S., but other economies in Latin America if the U.S. is going to continue to impose tariffs on them. So.
Yeah.
What
the U.S. has also done, they've imposed a special port fee, right, on Chinese built ships. So, I don't know what the normal fee is, but it's like 5 times or even more what another ship would pay to be in a U.S. port. So, it would be logical to go to Latin America and drop the goods there and then a smaller vessel to go to the U.S.
Right, that's right.
To avoid that extra port fee.
I think that's...
You say in Spanish, echa la ley, echa la trampa, right?
See, yeah. I think that's on play. I think that's on process. Let's talk a little bit about... I want to give you an opportunity to talk about ACSS, and then we'll get into some aspects of sanction risk. How many members do you have today? I know you were co-founder since 2018, according to your bio. Is that right? 2018 is.
Yes.
So what is that? 7 years now. So congratulations.
Thank you.
How many members? Just talk a little about how many members, how many different chapters you have around the globe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we are closing in on 2,000 members.
Okay.
And we have. Our members are very diverse. So we have not just banks, people at banks who work in compliance joining our association at ACSS, but also like logistical companies, companies from, who do import-export, manufacturers, aviation, energy, pharmaceutical, etc. Because this is a topic that really touches upon, so many more industries than just the banks.
Right.
We, in terms of like our geographic footprint, we have now chapters in 7 or 8 countries. So we are in France, Denmark, the Netherlands, together with Belgium and Luxembourg. We sort of see that as a one region, Benelux. Then we have Singapore and the UAE. And then we have chapters in the US and London. So in the US, we have DC and we have New
New York.
York.
Yep.
And we're actually working on a chapter in Miami as well.
Yes, good. Well, welcome you here.
That'd be great. I lived in Miami myself, so it's very
Right.
close to my heart.
Well, in Miami, there's so much. Our seaport is growing. There's a lot of activity. So there's, we're, and then obviously it's a gateway to Latin America. So there are economic sanctions in the financial industry, but also in the shipping industry. And okay, good. Sounds like you're growing. You're continuing to grow and add new professionals to the membership organization.
I think the main reason why people come to ACSS is for our certification programs. So we have exam-based certifications that certify people either as a specialist in sanctions or as a specialist in export controls. So we have both programs. And it's interesting also because that even the banks are interested in the export controls topic. So this is something that is fairly new to them. Typically, they've been focusing on financial sanctions, right, or the perhaps sectoral sanctions, but really like export controls when you have to look at like what products are our clients paying for, what type of information do we see in a payment transaction. That is a big challenge for many of the banks. So
yeah, speaking of banks, so I want to ask you, I think this is a question that a lot of our listeners would appreciate, but particularly Latin America, but so how important is a sanction risk assessment? Let's put yourself in the shoes of a compliance officer for a financial institution, or just a board of directors of the financial institution. So how important is a sanction risk assessment, and how does one? Here's where it gets a little tricky. How does one factor in the unpredictability of a Trump 2.0 administration on sanctions?
Yeah,
and then let me follow up that with typically, and I'm sure you're gonna have lots of opinions about this, but typically risk assessments in general are done and updated every 12 to 18 months. We try to propose the client does it on an annual basis, right? Including a sanction risk assessment. Do you see this kind of fluid nature of sanctions? Should the assessment timetable be shortened? So I just want to ask you about the importance and then of the risk assessment on the sanction risks, and then how do you factor in this sort of very dynamic unpredictability, uncertainty in our world today?
Yeah, it's definitely not an easy task. Typically what I see is that, the risk assessment, like you said, is being updated, once a year, unless there are material changes. Well, yeah, there are, often material changes. I mean, look at any conference, on sanctions. You have speakers who need to adjust their presentation the day of the, presentation because things have changed again, overnight. So the same thing that goes for risk. And what we see now is that the sanctions compliance officers are now, they used to be, I sometimes see what happened, to anti-money laundering with 9/11. That is very similar to what we see right now in the sanctions world after the war in the Ukraine. Now this topic has become a board level discussion because of the big effect that it has on companies and on their revenue and on their risk exposure. So we see sanctions compliance officers, just like the AML officers after 9/11, they're being, taken out of their basements, where they used to sit, and now they go to the board level, the board level floor of the of the building to brief the board of directors on what's next.
Right. As
And
it
it
should
is
be.
really, as it should be. But that's, that hasn't been the case always. Typically you may have legal there or risk, but not the sanctions person, because this thing is it changes so much that, you cannot, unless you work on this full time, you really cannot keep track of this.
Do you see institutions having a separate sanction compliance officer, like separate from the AML compliance officer, like just a new role for who could just focus full time on this, right? Did you see this trend?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. I mean, we get calls here at ACSS, from both larger and smaller companies. Like in a large company, somebody may have been part of the AML team, and now they are full-time on sanctions. So they really need to dive in this topic, and deeply to be able to, do their jobs. And in smaller companies, you may have had somebody who was dealing with general regulatory compliance. And now we get people who call us and say, Saskia, I used to be head of accounting, and now they made me the sanctions officer in I'm in a logistics company. I work in a port, and now they call me the sanctions officer. Help, what can I do to come up to speed? So you see that it's really becoming like a niche position in a niche area of compliance.
Yeah. So on this one, I'm just curious to get an answer on the risk assessment timetable. I mean, it's always a burden to do an actual risk assessment, but would you recommend that the timetable for doing it be shortened?
Yeah.
Given, I mean, what's your just?
I think that is wise. To do that, because I mean that it's.
Right.
Overnight, things can change because it's so political, compared to anti-money laundering. With anti-money laundering, it's very much, most countries go after the same bad guys.
True.
But with sanctions, one country likes this,
it's more subjective
figure, right? And the other country doesn't. So, and then you have a change in the regime, and then it changes.
Right.
So I think you cannot compare it in that respect with the anti-money laundering risk assessment. This needs a more frequent
timetable, like a more heightened focus. What do you at ACSS see as far as like emerging trends and that you're tracking? What advice would you give sanction compliance officers on how to mitigate their sanction risk? It's a broad question, but just given that we are in May of 2025 and so much happening in the world, that we'll end with this question. What are some of the emerging trends, and then what advice would you give sanction compliance officers on how to mitigate their sanction risk?
Yeah, it depends on what you're looking at. Like I think as an advice to a sanctions compliance officer, if you really want to get into this field, you need to like to read a lot, I mean, the packages just in the EU, the packages that come out of the council here at the European Union, I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of pages, and then you have to figure out what changes. So definitely, if you want to get a tip, if you want to get into this field and really specialize, you have to like to read. You also have to like to, follow the news, because it is something that is very topical and it's in the news all the time. In terms of trends, I think, it used to be that sanctions were, there were sanctions on Cuba and very few companies did business with Cuba. There were sanctions on North Korea. Okay, who does business with North Korea? Not that many. So everything that's even smelled a little bit like Cuba or North Korea, like blanket, big red light, nobody wanted to touch it, nobody wanted to do business. I think what you see now that the sanctions are more surgical, you need a more surgical approach. What can we do and what can we not do? And if you know that very well, you can gain a competitive advantage, versus your competitor who may think, well, we cannot do business with Venezuela. Yes, you can.
Right.
Yes, you can do business with Venezuela. So you cannot do business with the government of Venezuela. So, if that is, I think you see more specialists coming into this field that can help their companies navigate this topic in a way that they don't say, okay, sorry, we cannot do business at all. Yes, you can.
Right. Yeah.
That's seen as a trend. Yeah.
Yeah. I agree with that. I mean, yeah, just because Venezuela is on different sanction lists and a target of OFAC, it doesn't mean you can't do business in Venezuela or with Venezuelan companies. But you just have to understand how to navigate that. I think, do you see, just one other question that came up, I mean, just as you're responding, the use of tools like artificial intelligence to help sort of summarize, interpret. Do you see in your organization, are you discussing AI and how AI can be used as a tool to assist in terms of staying informed, reviewing and analyzing quickly all this reading material that exists out there? How do you see sort of AI participating in sanction compliance for officers who operate within organizations?
Yeah, I see definitely what I hear at conferences when I'm at panels or speaking at conferences. What I hear is that AI is definitely being used. In the compliance programs, they are using AI to sort of gather all the facts together, like the negative news check,
right.
The KYC information that is, somewhere in the company, to get faster to get a good overview of what a particular, hit means against a sanctions list. What I haven't seen is that artificial intelligence is being used to actually close an alert, right? So you can gather information for the analyst to look at it. And then a human will ultimately say, yes, we can close this alert, with a potential hit against the list. So
for now.
Yeah, for now. So right. I'm sure that will change. So I think it helps a lot in terms of the, gathering all the pieces of information that somebody needs to make a decision on whether or not, this is a prohibited transaction.
Yeah. Yeah. So this was great. I had 10, 11 questions. We covered them all, and we did it in good time. And I always like to close every podcast episode on a lighter note. And so I always ask a question about one of my favorite topics is music. So you are Dutch, is that right? Yes. Okay. So I'm going to ask you, just researching Dutch and music, the one thing that jumps out is electronic dance music is so big in the Netherlands. Some of the sort of biggest artists in the world. Actually, they travel to Miami every March for one of the biggest festivals in the world, the Ultra Music Festival. They're all Dutch. They're Armin van Buuren and Tiesto and
Tiesto, Afrojack,
Hardwell. So, are you first of all, are you a fan of the electronic dance music, being that you are Dutch and these are your fellow Dutchmen? And second, what is the Dutch kind of fascination with electronic dance music? Like, what's the root of it? It's very curious how there's so much concentration of these very kind of celebrity EDM superstars. They all come from your country. So I was curious, if number one, are you a fan?
No, I'm actually not a fan of electronic dance music. Mm-hmm. I have been to a festival though. Mm-hmm. There's a great festival. It's called Tomorrowland, and they have a winter edition. And I like skiing. Okay. So I actually went with a friend to the winter festival of that, and it's actually in a ski resort. So it was super nice. And it's just being outside and then seeing the whole vibe of the festival was super nice. Yeah, so I liked. I'm not a fan of the music, but in that winter festival, it was amazing.
You were a fan that weekend.
Yeah, it was super. It was a great experience. I've also been at a summer festival here in the Netherlands, and it was, I don't know, it was all these people that looked like zombies, and they were like, it was not my scene.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't hang out long in the summer festival, but it was, yeah, I mean, the Dutch, why we have this, why we're so big in this, I frankly don't know. I do know that some artists that actually are from other countries, they adopt a name that sounds Dutch.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so to sort of give the others the impression that they are Dutch.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
there's something very unique about the Dutch and this this style of music, which I think dates back to probably like the 1950s. I mean, it goes back many years with just the advent of electronic sounds and electronic music being incorporated into pop music. But it is big. I mean, every March at the end of the month, we get in Miami, I don't know, I want to say 100,000 people come for this event.
Mm-hmm.
It's a 3-day festival. And we have learned to coexist with them over the weekend because they just take over downtown Miami. But they play by the rules in terms of like, they don't, there's a certain time that they have to shut off, and they do. And they have plenty of police presence, and it's actually an economic boom for the city.
That's
but
great.
Yeah, you get zombies, non-zombies. It's very interesting to me, that style of music. I've been to that festival a couple of times, and it's enjoyable, but been there, done that. And that's it.
Is that your favorite music?
Not at all.
Okay.
Not at all. But I could see the appeal of it. It's almost like trance-like, and people are in this kind of trance because it's the same beat. And I could see it's almost like meditative for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I could see the appeal. I can understand it. But yeah, I mean, it's not for, and it's mostly young people, right? 18, 19, 20-year-olds. So, but anyway, that's our little take on electronic dance music from the Netherlands. Thank you, Saskia.
Yeah. Thank you, Alberto.
Yeah. So with that, I just want to, for those, again, thank you for tuning in. If just follow the link below so you can watch not only this episode, but previous episodes. We've covered Trump for the last 4 or 5 months, and other topics related to risk management in Latin America. So thank you again for tuning in. Stay tuned for our next episode coming up soon. And Saskia, once again, thank you for participating today.
Thank you very much, Alberto.